Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to week 4 of this Bible class titled Not Just Creation versus Evolution, where we are exploring topics that are at the intersection of faith and science. Welcome to those of you who may be here for the first time. If you're joining us online, once again, there is a call-in or text-in number, and it's printed on the screen there. It's 262-374-5957, so feel free to text or call questions, and Amelia Louth would be happy to forward your question on to me. So what I'd like to do today is to open with a psalm reading. Once again, so we've looked at a few different psalms at the beginning of our Bible class. This time we'll read Psalm 34. I'll read this to you, and once again, what I'd like you to do is keep your eyes open for echoes of creation, the creation account within this psalm. Sing joyfully to the Lord, you righteous. It is fitting for the upright to praise him. Praise the Lord with the harp. Make music to him on the 10-stringed lyre. Sing to him a new song, play skillfully and shout for joy. For the word of the Lord is right and true, he is faithful in all he does. The Lord loves righteousness and justice, the earth is full of his unfailing love. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, their starry host by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea into jars, he puts the deep into storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the people of the world revere him. For he spoke, and it came to be. He commanded, and it stood firm. The Lord foils the plans of the nations. He thwarts the purposes of the peoples. But the plans of the Lord stand firm forever, the purpose of his heart through all generations. Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance. So a quick quiz. Do you see any of the days of creation echoed in this psalm? Sure, John.
Separating waters from waters, I think that's day 3.
Yep, day 3. So you've got separating waters from waters, I guess the waters below and the waters above, that's day 2, okay? But if you think about separating waters from the land, that would be day 3, right? When God separated water from land and also brought forth the vegetation on the land. Okay, is there anything else about creation in there? Yeah.
In verse 6, where it says the heavens were made and mentions the stars, like planets and stuff.
Very good. So anybody know what day that is? Anybody remember? Day 4, exactly, right? So day 4, good. Yep. So I think we've gone through, 4 different psalms now, and they all have these similar kinds of themes in them, right? And I always find that fascinating when reading the Psalms. Okay, so tell you what, let's jump back into the topic that we had been discussing last time. Where were we? So you might remember that we had spent a little bit of time talking about the scientific revolution. I won't spend a lot of time going through that again, but you might remember that before the scientific revolution, it was kind of taken for granted that the existence of God could be demonstrated, that it was something that was taken for granted, that you look at the world and you can infer the existence of God. Even if you weren't a Christian, you didn't have scriptures, that was obvious. And then really after the scientific revolution, that perspective changed, and it was no longer taken for granted. And you might think that during the time of the scientific revolution, maybe around the 1700s, maybe the 1800s even, maybe there was somebody who came up with some brilliant laboratory experiment that conclusively demonstrated that there wasn't a God, or maybe there was some proof, some rigorous argument brought forth that showed that there was no God. But that's just not the case. What really happened is that there was more of a change in the philosophy of science. There wasn't some rigorous argument showing God doesn't exist. There was a change in how science was being approached around the time of the scientific revolution. They were jettisoning the ancient and medieval view of science and really taking on, I would say, a modern and mechanistic view of science. And we spent some time talking about that. So what I'd like to do, what I did then last time, is started reviewing some of the arguments, some of the classic arguments for the existence of God. And this may not be your thing. You might say, well, I believe in God. I don't need a proof of it, right? And if that's, that's fine, okay? But some people really, if they're coming at this for the first time, they might, if they're considering Christianity, they maybe have a friend who's a Christian and they want to know something about it, but they've been told, in college classes or by somebody that they know that they respect that, science has disproven God or something to that effect. It's really nice to be able to say, well, actually, that's not the case, right? And so think about these sorts of arguments not as some kind of slam dunk, you're going to say this and someone's going to become a Christian. That's not really how these things work, right? We know the Holy Spirit works through the gospel to bring people to faith. But we really want to make sure that people don't have misconceptions. We want to correct errors that people might have. So think about it in that way, okay? So what we did last time is we began talking about the argument from design, and you might remember that this was really made famous in the 1800s, early 1800s, 1802, by a guy named William Paley, and the argument was essentially that if you're walking on a beach and you find a watch, you might not know who made it, or you might not know why they made it, or when they made it, or how they made it, but you immediately intuit that this was made. There's something about it, that the way that the parts all fit together, right away, you just grasp that was made, right? And that's essentially simply the argument from design. If you look at nature, you get the sense immediately that it was made. There's something about the way everything fits together, it makes sense that it's made. So that argument was really made popular in the early 1800s by William Paley, and then it was picked up and developed in more recent years, probably the last 20, 30 years or so, by folks that came to be known as the intelligent design movement, and I talked a bit about this, and this is a slide that it's an image from a textbook, and this image is of a bacterial flagellum, okay? And this has become kind of the mascot for the intelligent design folks in a way. And what it shows is, what is a bacterial flagellum? Again, it's basically a whip-like structure that's attached to a motor that goes through the cell, it's attached to the cell body of certain microorganisms. And it's able to rotate. This whip rotates at something like 1,000 revolutions per minute. It can stop on a dime and go the other way. It's used for the cell to move around. And it's not just like a machine, it really is a machine. It's got all the parts of a motor. It's got O-rings, it's got a way to transmit fuel to it, it's got switches, it's got structural components that keep everything aligned just right to make it work. I mean, this thing is exquisite, right? And this is just one thing here. So if you look at this, it seems right away that this is designed, right? You get that sense. In the same sense, if you look at an automobile, it's designed. And this is, the cell is more complicated than that, right? So that's what's happening in these arguments. So I had a quote from William Dembski. William Dembski is one of the, probably one of the most well-known of the folks in this intelligent design movement. He was trained as a mathematician and a philosopher. Another guy that's involved in this is Michael Behe. He's a biochemist at Lehigh University. I think he's still at Lehigh University. But there's a quote here which says, "The fundamental claim of intelligent design is straightforward and easily intelligible. Namely, there are natural systems that cannot be adequately explained in terms of undirected natural forces and that exhibit features which in any other circumstance we would attribute to intelligence." Okay? So if you saw this in any other context, you would say, oh, obviously someone designed that. Okay? So your kind of reasoning about machines applies to this as well. Right? That's the crux of this kind of argument. If you are interested in this kind of thing, and you'd like to read, is that me? If you're interested in this kind of thing, and you'd like to read a bit more about it, William Dembski has written some really nice books. One of them that I assigned parts of it for some of my students to read in one of my classes. It's called No Free Lunch, and it was published in 2004, I believe. So there's a copy of it right here. So I've got a copy. It's called No Free Lunch. It's a neat book, and the first chapter of it is very accessible. So I have my students read the first chapter. It's really nice. It's a fairly easy read. After that, it gets a little bit more technical. So if you like the really technical side of things, you can pursue that. But the first chapter is a really nice chapter to read. It gives you a sense of how the folks in the intelligent design community approach this. Does anyone have any questions up until this point? Okay, so remember also last time that I mentioned that this kind of argument, the argument from design, is a probabilistic kind of argument. It's sometimes called an inductive proof or an inductive argument. So let me remind you what is meant by that. So an inductive proof is kind of like the sort of proof that's used in a court of law, right? So you bring forth these testimonies that argue for the guilt or innocence of someone who's accused, and then the jury has to decide based on the evidence whether or not that person is guilty or innocent, right? It's not a deductive kind of proof. We'll talk about that in a minute. It's not a deductive kind of proof that you might meet in a math class or a mathematics course. Rather, it's bringing forth evidence and then making a compelling argument. So it's probabilistic in nature. So this is the kind of argument that's used in a court of law. It's also the kind of argument that scientists routinely use in order to argue various points. So we talked about the work of J.J. Thomson. He was the one who discovered the electron back in 1896. Did he ever see the electron? No. He never saw an electron. We haven't seen an electron. Nobody's seen an electron. What we do is we do experiments in the laboratory, and we say, well, these experiments, they would make sense. Everything would fit together if there was this thing called an electron. And so I think there's an electron because it would make a lot of other things make sense. And he has to make a compelling argument to that effect. That's the way Thomson argued for the existence of electron. That's how the structure of DNA was discovered. What people did is they took the nucleus, a part of a cell, they shot X-rays at it, like when you go to get X-rays for your bones, they shot special X-rays at it. The X-rays bounced off of it, and the way that they bounced off of it, they said, this would really make sense, the way the X-rays are bouncing off of it, if the DNA was like a spiral structure or a helical structure, okay? So it's the same kind of argument. You're not seeing the thing directly, rather you are inferring what it has to be like based on indirect evidence, okay? And that is exactly the kind of argument that people like Paley and Dembski and others are making for the existence of God, right? Saying these things around us would make sense if there was a God, an intelligent agent who did this, okay? So it's the same style of argument. Does that make sense? Are you happy with that? So one shouldn't be any more skeptical of arguments for the existence of God than one should be skeptical of arguments for the existence of electrons. They might be good or bad arguments. Every argument you have to assess, is this a good argument or a bad argument, the same way you do with anything else, right? So you can critique these sorts of arguments, but you shouldn't a priori or beforehand say, well, this is not a good argument, right? You should say, well, is this a good argument for the existence of God? Just like you'd say, is this a good argument for this person being guilty or innocent? So, okay? Yes, please. Yes, many. So in fact, that's the way science happens a lot of times. So I'll give you an example right now that's a big one among the physics community, okay? So if you look through telescopes, you're looking up at the stars, you look at these galaxies, like groups of stars out in the distance, and you look at the way that they're moving. They're some of them are spinning around. They're called spiral galaxies. And you can measure how fast they're spinning by looking at them over time and doing some measurements like that. And it ends up that they're spinning around and they're kind of grouped together in a way that's very inconsistent with our understanding of gravity. So we think we understand gravity, how things pull on each other, but the way that these things are moving is completely inconsistent with it. So what do scientists say? Do they say, well, let's just get rid of the theory of gravity? No. What they've done is they've said, well, maybe there's other stuff out there, other matter out there that we can't see yet. And if there was this other matter inside of that galaxy that's invisible, that we can't see, that would account for how these galaxies are moving and how they're spinning. And they call that dark matter. Okay? So now there's this search for dark matter. Why? It's because it would, if we could find it, it would account for the way that we see things moving. Okay? And it's not a small effect. It's something like 85 or 90% different. It's a huge effect. Okay? It's like we're missing like 85% of the matter that should be there in order to account for the motion of galaxies. So that's just another example of the kind of thing that scientists say, well, we can't see it. That's why they call it dark matter, okay? Because you can't see it. And yet, if it was there, it would account for things that we do see. Does that make sense? Are you happy with that? Or? right? So the question is, if scientists are using those kind of arguments, why can't we, right? And that's exactly the point that I think is sometimes forgotten. People have this sense that, scientists are hard-nosed and they sort of just, give me, like, if I have to see it before I believe it. Well, yeah, there's a sense that it's like that, but we always in science are talking about things we don't see to explain things that we do, right? And that's the whole point that I'm trying to make, is that is the kind of argument that people who are advocating for intelligent design and William Paley and so on are saying, well, we can use the exact same kind of argument for the existence of God. Now, you can say it's a good or bad individual argument one is giving, but the style of the argument, this kind of inductive argument, is the same kind of thing. So I think you put your finger on the point. Good. Yes?
Isn't this how a number of the planets were initially predicted as having to be there or have
Very
certain
good.
properties or sizes before they were actually observed?
Yes, that's exact. So the question was, isn't this how some of the planets were discovered? And that's exactly right. So up until, I'm not going to get the date right, but Neptune, I believe, was discovered in the 1880s or something. I'm not going to get the date right. But nobody saw the planet Neptune. What they saw is they were looking at Jupiter and it was moving in kind of a funny way. And they'd say, well, that would be weird if Jupiter does these bizarre things. We can either throw out our whole theory of gravity, or we can say maybe there's another planet over here we haven't discovered yet. And so people turned their telescope over there, and sure enough, they discovered, then they could see the planet, right? So there is a postulation that there must be something out there that we don't see to account for things that we do see, okay? Yes, please. So the question is, what is the counter argument that they would provide if I say something like this, or someone says something like this to an atheist scientist, or atheist anybody, right? Who says, well, you can't see God, therefore I don't believe in him. I haven't heard a good counter argument. Okay. Sometimes they'll say yes, but we have the possibility at some point of seeing the planet. Whereas your God, there's no possibility of ever seeing him, okay? So sometimes that's the kind of counter argument that's being presented. Yeah, they'll say, right, well, you'll see, exactly, right. But for that matter, I mean, scientists talk about a lot of things that we'll never see. Like we talk about energy, right? And like, show me an energy. It's not a thing you see, right? It's a concept, it's a feature that's invisible, but that's used to understand things that we do see, right? So I think that's why this kind of argument is such a compelling argument, because it takes for granted, look, you're doing this. You scientists are doing this kind of thing. So why should you have a double standard, right? So, and that's, because if they reject this kind of argument, they would have to throw out a whole bunch of other stuff they're already doing, right? And that's what it puts them in a difficult position, right? And not just scientists, it puts anybody in a difficult position, because people want to be consistent, or at least they want to think of themselves as being consistent, right? Okay. All right. But also keep in mind that if you're going to make an argument like this, say there's some kind of probabilistic argument for the existence of God, you're going to be subject to critiques, and people are going to cross-examine it just like they do in a court of law or in a scientific conference. So it's not immune to that. If you're going to engage in this kind of thing, then you should be aware that there are going to be people who are going to push back. And there's been a lot of pushback against this argument from design. So I have a quote up here by a guy named Richard Dawkins. Some of you may have heard of him. He's a very outspoken evolutionist and an atheist evolutionist. So he's very outspoken that there is no God. And he is one of these, he's a scientist who says everything that we see around us, the birds, the animals, everything you see can be accounted for by appealing to chance. Okay, so chance ultimately is it's a valid mode of explaining everything we see, okay? And specifically chance variations in organisms, right? The phenomena of natural selection, so things undergo these variations, and then the ones that have the variations that help them survive, they survive, natural selection, which that in itself isn't really controversial, right? People have known for like thousands of years that the strong animals survive, right? That's not a controversial thing. Like if animals are missing limbs or something, they don't survive, and the ones that are faster survive. So that's not really controversial. What's controversial is that that alone can account for everything. In fact, the emergence of life and the transition between the species and so on. That's what was controversial about this, and I think still is controversial about it. But Dawkins, he says, and here's a quote, he says, natural selection is the blind watchmaker. So he's kind of alluding to Paley's argument, the watchmaker argument, right? Natural selection is the blind watchmaker, blind because it does not see ahead, does not plan consequences, has no purpose in view, yet the living results of natural selection overwhelmingly impress us with the appearance of design as if by a master watchmaker. So in other words, we all agree nature looks designed. That's not what's at issue here. The question is whether it's an illusion or not. And Dawkins will say it's an incorrect conclusion to say that the appearance of design implies actual design. So it's an illusion. This stuff, although it appears to have arisen by design, really it can be accounted for by chance. Chance, I know it's unlikely for this to have happened, for us to be sitting here, having this discussion, using technology and all this kind of stuff. It's unlikely for that to have happened purely by chance, but look at, we are here. So it must have happened by chance. Okay? That's essentially the argument. That's given enough time, the unlikely becomes inevitable. That's kind of one of the standard arguments. I know it's unlikely, but given enough time, even the unlikely becomes inevitable. I think the implications of that argument are troubling, okay, because it means everything that's possible must happen, okay, so I don't think you want to take that too far, but that's the kind of thing that's argued, okay? So according to people like Dawkins, he will say that chance does provide a plausible explanation of everything we see around us. That's at root this perspective, okay? And it's really hard to get around this, right? Because you're making a probabilistic argument. The Christian is saying, well, or even not the Christian, somebody who believes in a designer and believes in a God is saying it couldn't have arisen by chance, it's too unlikely. And then the atheist says, well, it did arise by chance. I mean, I know it's unlikely, but it did. No, it didn't. Yes, it did. No, it didn't. Yes, it did. So it's really hard because you're making a probabilistic kind of argument, and then it's really hard to actually calculate the probabilities, right? It's not. That's something that people like William Dembski in his No Free Lunch book have tried to do. And people will debate whether or not it's a good kind of calculation, whether it's reliable or not. That's the attempt. But these are really hard arguments to make a slam dunk case for that reason, because it's a probabilistic argument, okay? One thing that I find interesting about this, by the way, is the argument that things arose by chance through evolution isn't really new. People think of it as something that Darwin came up with in the 1850s. But if you do a little bit of research, history of science, if you read Aristotle, I brought up Aristotle a few times in this class. I'll do it one more time, maybe more than once. But so if you read Aristotle, he addressed this exact same issue. He addressed the issue of whether chance is a valid mode of explanation for everything we see around us. And he said no. Keep in mind, Aristotle, again, was not a Christian, right? He's an ancient Greek pagan philosopher. And there was another person around the time of Aristotle named Empedocles, another philosopher. And Empedocles, this is 400 BC, okay? So a long time ago, 2,400 years ago. And Empedocles argued that, well, maybe everything we see around us, like animals, have sharp teeth because the ones that happened to develop sharp teeth survived and passed on their, to their ancestors, those properties, and the ones that didn't have those variations, they died. Okay, that was the idea of Empedocles. And Aristotle, in his book, The Physics, addressed this, and he's here reciting Empedocles' ideas, and then he's going to shoot them down. He says this isn't a good explanation. Okay, so this is when he's quoting Empedocles. So this gives you a flavor for, if you do a little bit of research, you can find Aristotle said, and here he's kind of rephrasing Empedocles' argument. He says, our teeth, the front teeth sharp, fitted for tearing, the molars broad and useful for grinding down the food, they did not arise for this purpose, but it was merely a coincident result. Okay? So he's saying this is what Empedocles is teaching. And he says, and so with all the other parts in which we suppose that there is a purpose. Wherever all the parts came about just how they would have been if they had come to be for a purpose, such things survived, being organized spontaneously in a fitting way, whereas those which grew otherwise perished and continue to perish. Okay, does that sound familiar? Okay, I mean, that's basically he's saying survival of the fittest and kind of an evolutionary approach to how organisms arise. And then Aristotle goes on to say, and yet this is not a good explanation. Okay, he says because when things happen in certain patterns in a way that's continuously the same way over years, it's not good enough to argue that chance does this. That's his argument, that chance is not a convincing explanation for it. Okay, so this is the same kind of thing. You see this argument 2,400 years ago, right? And now you see it today, right? So there's nothing entirely new under the sun. Okay. Let me talk about one other angle on the design argument, or the argument from design. I think a lot of people think about biological organisms when they think of the argument from design, but this issue comes up also in physics, cosmology, specifically, kind of how the cosmos or how everything is arranged. And this is called the fine-tuning argument, and you might have heard of this kind of argument before. If not, this might be the first time. So I have a quote up here by Stephen Hawking. Okay, and Stephen Hawking is himself not a Christian, to say the least, right? So he's very hostile to Christianity. And he is, I'll read this in a moment, but he is stating here what the problem is, okay, the fine-tuning argument. And it's basically this, that if you look at nature, and you look at certain fundamental constants of nature, like the charge of the electron, and how strong gravity is, and the mass of the proton, all these sort of things in nature that are fixed, they all seem to take on very precise values that make it possible for us to be here. And if one of these things were changed just by a hair, like if gravity was just a bit stronger, then all the stars in the galaxy would just collapse in on themselves, and we wouldn't be here. And if the electron charge was just, like 0.1% different than it is, well, then chemicals wouldn't bond in the way that they do, and we wouldn't have these metabolic processes, and we wouldn't be here. So there seems to be this very fine tuning of these fundamental constants of nature. This is no secret. Physicists, cosmologists are well aware of this. This is called the fine tuning problem. Like, why is that? That's so weird. Everything seems to be tuned in this way that allows us to survive. And that's exactly what Hawking is saying here. I'll read it. He says, the laws of science as we know them at present contain many fundamental numbers, like the size of the electric charge of the electron and the ratio of the masses of the proton and the electron. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Okay, so that's Stephen Hawking in his book, A Brief History of Time from 1988. So he's very well aware of this problem. I've gone to conferences and people wring their hands about this. How do we explain this? And people come down on all different sides of this argument. But they're aware of the problem. From a theistic perspective, it's not really a surprise, right? We'll say, well, that kind of makes sense. God designed things, right? It kind of is. It's one of these signatures of a designer. But if you reject that idea out of hand, well, no, we can't invoke the existence of God. Then you've got to invoke some kind of chance. Well, maybe there are many, many universes, and we just live in one that has these particular constants of nature, and that's why we're here. So there's a lot of those kind of finagling to try to get out of this this observation of nature. Yes? Is that where the Boltzmann brain came from? I think that's trying to address a slightly different problem, but it might be related. So I'm not going to be able to speak to that, but I'll look into it. Thank you, Isaac. All right. I just dodged that question entirely. Any other questions? Okay. All right. So I want to make a few concluding, this is a huge topic, and I hope I'm whetting your appetite, giving you a sense of how these sort of things go. But just evaluating this, how does one think about the argument from design? I think it's a good argument. I personally find this kind of argument very compelling. I think it's a good argument because people grasp it right away. It's intuitively obvious, right? In fact, to argue against it, you have to use pretty subtle reasoning, right? And you have to really, it's a difficult problem. But what are some of the problems with the argument from design? And I already talked about one of them. I think that one of the problems is that it really is a probabilistic argument. And so it's not the kind of argument that people can always get around it. The atheist has wiggle room. They say, well, yeah, I know it's unlikely, but it happened. End of story. You know, so and it's not like you can prove that wrong, right? You can say, well, that's just implausible. No, it's not. Yes, it is. That kind of thing. So it's a probabilistic argument. So in that sense, it's weak, but no weaker than any other kind of inductive argument, right? So if you're going to argue in a court of law or in science, these same kinds of arguments are used. In any case, it's a weakness, right? But I think there's a deeper weakness to this kind of argument. And again, this isn't a showstopper. Like I said, I find this kind of argument convincing, but there's a danger of this kind of argument. And the danger of the argument, I think, is it tends to take the modern mechanistic view of the world for granted. So what do I mean by that? When people are arguing that the bacterial flagellum, you know, the bacteria, how it moves around, you know, is a machine. It's a complicated machine that can't be explained unless you have a designer. It's really taking for granted that it is just a machine. And likewise, you and me, right? So our existence, we have these we're complicated biological organisms. And if you're going to say, well, it was organized in this special way by a designer, it had to have been done that way, and look at us, we're just like a machine, it leaves the impression that we are just machines, right? And if you just understand how this machine works, then you really understand the human being. And I think that's a dangerous kind of thing to assume. And a lot of the people who argue in this way for the designer walk into that trap, because it gives the impression that you don't need a soul, you don't need anything else except these mechanical things to fully account for the human being or for dogs or for plants or anything like that. And it's really taking this modern mechanistic view for granted. And I think there are problems with that. Okay? So I think you should be aware of that if you're going to be deploying an argument like this. Okay? And it blurs, in particular, it blurs the distinction between artifacts and natural things. Okay, so what do I mean by that? An artifact, this is a historical distinction that was really used throughout the ancient and medieval times, but seemed to be blurred or outright rejected in modern times. In ancient times, people talked about artifacts are things that people make, and natural substances are things that people don't make. Okay, so for example, think about an oak tree. That would be an example of a natural substance. Nobody makes an oak tree. Okay. But if I were to cut off a branch of this oak tree and to carve it into a table, right, that would then be an artifact. It's something that I made. Okay? Now, certainly the wood that I'm making out of it still is a natural substance, but insofar as it's a table, it's an artifact. It's something that I made. So there's this distinction that had been made historically between natural substances and artifacts. And the argument from design tends to blur that distinction and make it sound like natural substances like people and trees and so on are just artifacts in the same sense that machines and computers and things like that are. Okay, so that's maybe just a way of thinking about it and drawing your attention to this problem, I think, with this argument. Okay? Any thoughts about that? Yes?
If we're going to reach people who have a different worldview than us, to some extent we have to argue things from their perspective, maybe, don't we?
Yeah, so the comment is if we're going to reach people that are coming from a different perspective than us, in a sense you have to use things that they can relate to. And I think that's exactly right, you do. And that's why I think, this, like I said, this is a powerful argument. And the fact is we do in many ways behave like machines, right? I mean, the digestive system, the system of, the respiratory system behaves like bellows and so on. So you can use these mechanical comparisons. But the question is whether that fully explains the human being. And I think that's a really hard sell. Nobody's been able to sell it, okay, in a convincing way that the human being is just a machine. And I think maybe this is why this kind of argument, people really like this argument today because we're all moderns now and we think of things as like machines, right? So this is really appeals to people. But if you're looking at it from an older perspective, it has weaknesses. It has this flaw of seeing everything as just machines, okay? Good? Other thoughts? Okay. Now I want to go on to another kind of argument. So I've been talking about the argument from design, which was an inductive argument, but some of the arguments for the existence of God are structured in a different way. They're called deductive arguments, or deductive proofs. So I want to just mention a few things about what I mean by that, and then I want to go through one of the deductive arguments for the existence of God, okay? So what do we mean by a deductive argument? Well, a deductive argument is the kind of argument that you might see in like a geometry class. So if someone was going to try to prove that two straight lines never cross or something like that. How does that kind of proof work? You know, maybe you like these kind of things, maybe you don't, okay? But they're used in geometry classes, but not exclusively in geometry classes. So I'll give an example where it's not a mathematics example. But they generally tend to start with some axioms or premises. And these axioms or premises, these starting points, are taken to be just self-evidently obvious, or that just everybody would agree on. And the way that these kind of proofs work is once you accept the axioms or the premises, then the conclusion just follows logically from that. It's not a probabilistic kind of argument. It's once you accept the premises, you're drawn irrefutably to the consequence. Okay? So it's a different style of proof. And so I've given an example here. This is, so here we go. Which one did I use? Oh, yeah. Oh, so here it is. So the first premise, all cats are mammals. Okay, that's called the first premise or the major premise. Okay? The second premise is Fluffy is a cat. Okay, that's your second premise, or sometimes called your minor premise. Once you accept those two premises, then you are drawn by logic to the conclusion that therefore Fluffy is a mammal, right? So once you accept those premises, the conclusion follows from it. There's nothing probabilistic about this. There's like a 20% chance of Fluffy being a mammal. No, it's once you accept the two premises, then the conclusion follows from it. That's the way the deductive proofs tend to work. Does that make sense? Do you see the difference between that and an inductive proof? So it's meant to be rigorous and irrefutable. So there's no probability. And why am I bringing this up? Because some of the classic arguments for the existence of God were framed as deductive proofs. Once you accept these premises, you're drawn irrefutably to the conclusion. Okay? So what I want to do is I want to talk about one of those proofs. And again, you might be into this kind of thing, maybe not. I'm assuming you are because you're here. But okay. Okay. So this one is called the argument from motion, or the argument from change. Okay, so what I want to do is just kind of walk you through how this goes. All right? So what is and this, by the way, is due to Aristotle. Okay, so this is by, once again, someone who is not a Christian, but he says you can demonstrate the existence of a God by reason, using this kind of deductive proof. And later on, this argument is picked up by, like I said before, Jewish and Muslim and Christian thinkers. Okay? So how does it go? He says, well, there is change in the world. Things change. He says there's motion in the world. But by motion, he means something a little more broadly than just like, you know, moving this cup from here to here. He would call that locomotion, motion in location from one place to another. But more generally, motion means anything that's changing. So it might be, you know, if your coffee is going from hot to cold, that would be motion in this sense. There's a change. Or if you are going from sickness to health, that would be another case of motion. Not location motion, locomotion, but there's a change going on. You were sick and now you're healthy. Okay? So that's, Aristotle starts from the basic statement, there's motion in the world. And it's really hard to argue against that, right? I mean, like, how do you argue against the fact that there's motion in the world? Things change. Okay? So he thinks that's a self-evident axiom. All right? Maybe I'll say one other thing here to set this up, is all these cases of motion, whether it's motion from one place to another, motion from sickness to health, motion from hot to cold, those are all examples of something potentially being one way and then actually becoming that. Okay? So maybe you're a sick person, but you're potentially healthy. So you can, if you actually become healthy, you're going from a state of potential health to a state of actual health. Okay? So that's actually the way that Aristotle talks about it. Things going from potential to actual. And that's a case of motion or change, right? This cup is right here right now, but it's potentially over here. Now it's actually over here. Okay? So there's a change from potential to actual. Okay? I am potentially a basketball player, right? I'm not actually a basketball player, right? Maybe if I trained or I had a coach or something, okay? So that's the idea. And Aristotle starts out by saying there is this change from potentiality to actuality. There's this motion that's visible in the world. Okay, that's the first premise. The second premise is that anything that changes, anytime you have something going from potential to actual, it requires a cause. Okay? Things don't, this cup moved over there because I moved it over there. You go from sickness to health because you took some medicine, right? There's causes for things. And that's really the starting point of most of science, right? We're studying what are the causes of changes, right? That's sort of what we do. So that seems to be a pretty obvious second premise. Things that undergo motion or change require a cause to do so, okay? Now, if we think about that cause, the thing that caused the change, and we think about that, well, that thing has to either itself be changing or be some kind of unchanging thing. Okay? So the thing that caused my cup to change, it has to itself change or not. Okay, those are the two possibilities. If it is something that itself is able to change things, but it doesn't change itself at all, it's an unchanged changer. It's some kind of fundamental thing that itself is able to effect change and yet remain totally unchanged itself. That's one possibility. The other possibility is the thing that's changing something, that's moving the cup from there to there, is itself changing. Well, then why is it changing? It has to require a cause, right? And you can kind of go back and say, well, that requires a cause, that requires a cause, and so on. But eventually, you have to have some reason why this whole series of events is changing. And so you have to end, if you don't want this to go on to infinity, you have to end in something that's able to change stuff in the world without itself changing. That would be the unchanged changer, or as Aristotle would call it, the unmoved mover. And this is precisely what he said. He said, there must be an unmoved mover, an unchanged changer. And this is what we all recognize to be God. Okay. Now, notice what it's not doing. It's not saying you're arriving at, Jesus is my Lord and Savior, right? All it's saying is that there has to be some thing at the beginning of this whole series that itself does not change and yet is able to affect all the change and motion in the world. That's the argument, okay? And Aristotle saw that as a convincing argument that there must be a God, okay? Again, he doesn't get to the Christian God, but he gets to the fact that there must be a God. That's the proof. Does that make sense? I mean, it's supposed to be fairly straightforward, and it's supposed to be deductive. Once you accept that there are changes in the world, and changes require a cause, and then also that you can't have an infinite series of changers because then you can't explain the whole thing, then you have to arrive at an unchanged changer, and that's where you get to God. Okay? That's how the argument goes. Any questions about that? Okay. Now, there have been a couple of ways that this argument has been used, and one of them is there was an Islamic philosopher named Al-Ghazali in the 11th century who was a Persian, and he used this kind of argument to argue for the existence of God. Okay? It came to be known as the KALAM argument because I think he wrote a book called KALAM or something to that effect. I don't remember exactly. The KALAM cosmological argument because it deals with the beginning of the cosmos, the beginning of the universe. And the way he phrased it, you'll see this is kind of like what Aristotle was saying. He says, whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's the first premise. Okay, whatever begins to exist has a cause. Okay, I think we can probably, maybe you could argue with that, I suppose. But if you accept that, whatever begins to have a cause. And then he says, well, the universe began to exist. Okay, that's the second premise. Therefore, the universe had a cause. Okay? And he said, whatever this cause is, it can't be the universe itself, right? The universe can't cause itself. It has to be some cause outside of the universe. And that, he says, is what we all call God. Okay? So that's the way that the KALAM argument goes. Now, of course, you can critique some of these things, and that's what people do. Okay? So let's look at how people critique this KALAM argument. Do I want to do that here or here? Yeah, so evaluating the KALAM argument. Again, how it goes is everything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist. It went from potentially existing to actually existing. There was a change there. So you can kind of see how this is like the Aristotelian argument, things going from potential to actual, and they require a cause. Therefore, the universe had to have a cause. How do people criticize this? Well, notice what's happening in this argument is that it's really talking about a cause in time. And there are people who argued that the universe didn't have a beginning, that the universe is eternal. It's been around forever. And if you're going to argue that the universe didn't have a beginning, then this whole argument falls apart, right? Because one of the premises is the universe had a beginning. And if someone denies that, well then if something doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't really need a cause, right? And that's precisely how many people argued against this, the KALAM argument. They said, I'll just believe that the universe is eternal. In fact, interestingly, Aristotle thought the universe was eternal in time. Aristotle thought that the universe had no beginning. He argued in a different way that it required a God, okay? He thought about God in a different way. But many modern cosmologists also, in order to avoid this kind of KALAM argument, they believed up until about the 1930s that the universe was past eternal. It never had a beginning. It's always been here. That way you can just avoid the entire what caused the universe problem. Because if it didn't have a beginning, you can dodge that whole issue, right? And so many cosmologists, many scientists, up until about 1930, rejected the idea that the universe had a beginning. Okay? What happened in about 1930, interestingly, so that's when Big Bang Theory came around, okay? And what the Big Bang Theory claimed was that the universe had a beginning, okay? And it was when there's a Big Bang, an explosion, okay? And it's interesting kind of the way that this worked out, right? Because a lot of the astronomers at the time said, oh no, right? So now we've got this guy arguing that the universe had a beginning, this Big Bang, and he's trying to sneak theology back into science, okay? That's actually why it was rejected at first, because the guy who came up with it himself in 1926 was a Belgian astronomer and Catholic priest named Georges Lemaitre, and he came up with Big Bang Theory. And at the time, people said, you know, great, we've got this Catholic priest who's trying to smuggle theology back into science. We thought we got rid of that because we thought that the universe had no beginning for a long time, and now we've got this guy who's trying to bring theology back in, okay? So it's just interesting historically how people, and then later on, you know, people said, okay, well, a lot of scientists kind of got on board with Big Bang Theory, but then the whole KALAM argument really comes back as a problem. If you're going to say the universe had a beginning, now it has to have a cause, and we've got to deal with this God issue, you know, so it became a problem for people again at that point. So it's interesting to look at the history of how that worked, okay? I mean, from a scriptural perspective, the universe also had a beginning, right? So we have a 6-day creation recorded in Genesis, and of course, that fits into the KALAM argument. The universe had a beginning and it had to have a cause. But it's interesting to see that you have these scientists, this sort of cognitive dissonance. If you're going to believe in Big Bang Theory, then it implies that there must be a cause of it, and so on. Okay, so that's an interesting way that this works out. Yes? Could you say that the Big Bang is the uncaused causer? Is that what you're saying? So notice how that doesn't work, okay? Because the Big Bang implies that there is a change, right? And any change has to have a cause. So if you're going to argue that the Big Bang was a change, which is hard to argue it's not, and that any change requires a cause, then it's hard to say that it sort of caused itself, right? Any more than saying a cup is able to all by itself move from here to there or something, right? So notice how this argument, the way it's phrased works is that anything that changes needs a cause for that change. Okay? Is that okay with you? You're not entirely satisfied. That's okay.
I think you could say that what caused the Big Bang was chance, and to say that statistics doesn't change, therefore it can cause that.
Yep. Okay, so want me to repeat the question? Okay, so the comment that Isaac is bringing up is, oh, good. Someone else has a comment.
Okay, someone said that it's fascinating. Even Aristotle points to our changeless God, although as Dr. Keene asserts, not the Savior God of Scriptures.
Yes, so that Aristotle points to a creator God, but not the Savior God, right? That's exactly right. To get to the Savior God, you need to have, Scripture and the historical records of Jesus dying and being resurrected, and so on. So that's, and then, yeah, exactly. So you're not getting at Jesus and the resurrection through this. That's exactly right. Okay. So the comment that Isaac brought up is, can you appeal to, if you were to take, for the sake of argument, a Big Bang cosmology, and say the universe, there was a Big Bang, and then say, well, chance was the cause of that. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
So I think you'd have to somehow make a case that you have to say that chance somehow is a sufficient explanation for it. And I think you're hard-pressed to say that chance can provide a sufficient explanation for it. And why wouldn't you just say, that, it's a question of whether chance really explains what you're trying to explain, right? And some people will argue that it does, right? But again, that's debatable, right? Other thoughts? Yes, please. Right. Right. So the comment is you're bringing in probability into what's supposed to be a deductive argument, okay? Which could be seen as either this isn't a valid deductive argument, right? Or it's a valid deductive argument and you're trying to bring something else into it. Yes? Okay, so Erica is saying that it's, how are we using the word chance? We're using the word chance almost as if it's like a god, right? As a something, the kind of thing. Again, what this argument is doing is it's saying there must be something that itself was unchanging that is able to change everything else. That's really all the argument's doing. And if you want to call that chance, I suppose you could, okay? But that's a weird definition of chance as something that's able to cause all the changes in the world without itself changing, right? Notice how modest the argument actually is. The argument is that there is something that is unchanging that is able to cause everything else, okay? And Aristotle and Al-Ghazali argued that that is at minimum what we mean by God. Something that is able to change everything, that causes everything without itself changing, okay? Now, we as Christians would go way beyond that, right? But minimally, that's what we mean by a God, right? Okay. Okay. How are we looking for time here? We got about 5 minutes left? Okay. Let me start on one other thing. I'm probably not going to get through this, but I can finish this up next time. So I mentioned that this argument, the KALAM argument, is really based on causes acting in time, right? So you basically have one thing causing another thing, and so on. But there's a different kind of causality that is really more akin to what Aristotle is trying to do here. So I want to draw a distinction here, okay, between two different kinds of causality. One of them is temporal causality, so one thing following another thing in time. So an example, this is actually pretty straightforward. So if you think about swinging a baseball bat and hitting a baseball, and then it flies over the fence and you get a home run, okay? There's a time ordering there. So you swing the bat, that comes first, and that's the cause of the ball flying through the air. And that ball then lands and you get a home run. So that's the cause of you getting a home run. So those are temporal causes where one thing follows the other. And another example of that, like if you look at us, like you have parents and they had parents and they had parents and they had parents. So the parents are the cause of the children, which is the cause of the children, and the cause of the children. So those are temporally ordered causes. And that's the kind of causality that Al-Ghazali and the KALAM argument is dealing with. If you go back in time, you have to get, he claims, a beginning of the universe. Right? That's the way that the KALAM argument works. But there's another kind of causality, and this is really more the kind that Aristotle was interested, which is sometimes called the hierarchical causality. It's not causality in terms of time ordering, but in terms of what's more fundamental or priority. Okay, so let me give an example of this. So I have here a stack of donuts, okay? Now, why is that top donut sitting there? Well, it could have fallen, it could have been somewhere else, but it's there and not somewhere else. So why is it there? Well, there's a cause for that. The cause is that the donut underneath it is holding it there, right? So that's not like a time-ordered kind of cause. That's an explanation for why that donut is there as opposed to somewhere else. Now you could say, well, why is that second donut there? Okay, well, you guessed it. There's another donut underneath it, right? So that provides an explanation of why that second donut's there. And why is that donut there? Well, there's one underneath there. Well, why is that donut there instead of falling down or whatever? Well, there's a table. And why is that table there? Well, because there's a ground, okay? So notice what's happening here. We're not explaining why something's there in terms of like a time ordering of events, but in terms of an explanation for why something is there in terms of some support for it, okay? And the argument that Aristotle presents for a God is not so much a time order, there must be a beginning of the universe in time, but there has to be a reason why things are here in the first place, why things are supported. And basically you have a situation where there's potential for things, there's a potential for that donut to be there, but it's actually there. So it could have been somewhere else. So there's sort of this notion of something, there is potentially something, and then it's actualized, or it becomes actual. And then you need to explain why that potential went to an actual. Well, you must have had something responsible for that. And that thing had to either go from potential to actual, or somebody had to explain that. And you can go back through this series of causes, and eventually you need to get back, if you want to explain this whole thing, you need to have something that explains everything else that is itself not changing at all. That doesn't need an explanation. And that is what we call God, he says. There has to be some fundamental unchanged changer, something that is able to account for the potential of the world being actualized without itself having to need to be actualized in any way. Okay? It's a little bit more of an abstract way of thinking about it, but that's how Aristotle approaches this. Not as far as like a time ordering of causes, but a sufficient reason or a principle for why things are the way they are. Okay? Yes?
You said Aristotle was not Christian.
He was not Christian, no.
So he just got to there to God, but
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. So he's not Christian, and yet he's arguing that logically, reasonably, deductively, one can arrive at a final, he called it a first cause, an unmoved mover, something that's able to make things actual without having to be, changed itself at all. Okay? So I mean, and for the Christian, we hear this, we think, well, yeah, God is unchanging. This language at least fits in with Christian theology. We would say way more about it, right? But it's consistent with a Christian theological perspective. And that's what many Christians later on said. They said, Aristotle we disagree with him about a lot of theological things, but this is right. Like the way he's arguing about this is correct. Okay? All right. So tell you what, I wanted to show a short clip. I'm going to run out of time. That's okay. But why don't we stop there, and I'll start next time with just concluding this argument, and then we'll go on to the next topic. Sound good? Okay. So why don't we close with a prayer? Lord God, Father in heaven, you created everything we see around us, and you yourself are infinite. Thank you for giving us this time, this opportunity to come together and to think about the wonders of you and your creation. Always keep us grounded in your word and trusting in what you have done for us. Through Jesus Christ, our Savior. Amen.